Let's talk about the US-China competition. Let's talk about the US-Russia competition, and then go to talking about Hungary. US-China competition. What's going on here is very simple. As a result of America's policy of engagement with China, which started in the early 1990s, we have foolishly helped turn China into an economically powerful country. China has grown very wealthy, and as you all know, it has a huge population. Population and wealth are the two foundations of military power. Because China has so many people and it's now so wealthy, it's not just a peer competitor to the United States, it's also a potential regional hegemon. And you know what the Chinese are doing? The Chinese are interested in becoming a regional hegemon. They want to dominate Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. And I want to be very clear here. I do not blame the Chinese 1 second. If I was in Beijing and I was running Chinese foreign policy, my aim would be to make sure that China is by far the most powerful country in Asia, and I would go to great lengths to push the Americans out beyond the first island chain and then beyond the second island chain. I'd have my own Chinese Monroe Doctrine, and I'd want to make sure the Americans are across the Pacific Ocean. Just like we want to make sure, from an American point of view, the Chinese are across the Pacific Ocean. The Chinese understand full well what happens when you're weak in the international system. They call it the century of national humiliation. It lasted from the late 1840s to the late 1940s. As most of you know, I'm sure, China was very weak during that 100-year period. And you know what happened to them when they were very weak? The other great powers in the system, including the United States of America, preyed upon them. They were victimized at every turn. The Chinese understand full well, if you want to survive in the international system, you want to be really powerful. Indeed, you want to imitate the United States. You want to dominate Asia the way the Americans dominate the Western Hemisphere. This is what my theory tells you. It's what the Americans did, and it's what the Chinese are doing. They want to dominate Europe. If the Chinese want to get Taiwan back, they want to control the South China Sea, they want to control the East China Sea, they want those rocks back in the East China Sea, there's one simple way to do it. Get the Americans out of East Asia and make sure they are the most powerful state in the system. So that's what they're doing. What about the Americans? I told you about the Americans before. The Americans do not tolerate peer competitors. We're not going to let China dominate Asia unless we absolutely have to. Unless China just grows so powerful, there's nothing we can do to stop it from dominating Asia. We've got our gun sights on the Chinese. You fully understand that, right? And you understand there's a military dimension and an economic dimension to our policy. We're putting together a balancing coalition in East Asia, mainly based around military forces to contain China. We're talking about how to defend Taiwan militarily. That's the military part of the balancing coalition, but you also want to understand, and I'll talk more about this later with regard to Hungary, there's an economic dimension to our strategy. We're actually trying to roll back Chinese economic growth. We want to strangle Chinese economic growth because we understand full well that military power is largely a function of economic power. So the United States, right? The United States is not simply containing China. We're talking about a rollback strategy. The United States, as many of you know, and probably many of you don't know, is a ruthless great power. You never want to underestimate how ruthless the United States is. Despite all the liberal rhetoric that we use to cover up our ruthless behavior, we are tough customers. And the Chinese are finding that out now. In the early 1990s, when I told the Chinese, if you continue to grow economically, there's going to be a fierce security competition, and you're going to be shocked at how ruthless the United States is. They simply didn't believe me, because the United States was treating them very well at the time. I said, what you don't understand is that the structure is going to change. And when the structure changes, when we go from unipolarity to multipolarity, and you're a peer competitor, we're going to think about you very differently than we think about you now. And that's exactly what's happening. So you see what's happened here is you have this intense security competition between the United States, which doesn't tolerate peer competitors on one hand, and China on the other hand, which is interested in becoming a regional hegemon, a peer of the United States, a full peer. Why is it so dangerous? I'm not going to go into this at any length, but Taiwan is the key here. Taiwan is a very dangerous situation. The United States feels that it has to defend Taiwan for security reasons. So you see the United States moving closer and closer to Taiwan. It's very important to understand that Taiwan is sacred territory for China. The Chinese are deeply committed to making sure that Taiwan does not remain independent over the long term and that it's incorporated back into the mainland. And we're basically saying, we meaning the Americans are basically saying, that's not happening, right? And we're tightening our relationship with Taiwan, which means de facto independence for the foreseeable future. And this, not surprisingly, enrages the Chinese. So this is a very dangerous conflict dyad.